love to turn it over to Greg. Greg is the founder of CultureIQ, a consultancy and organization that does just such great work around culture around the world. He also has published a book with so many insights and findings and best practices and case studies around thriving cultures. He's also one of the initial investors in Zappos, and just comes to this conversation with so many great strategies and thoughts for us all. So Greg, really excited to have you here and excited to learn from you. And I'll turn it over to you.
Wow, what a great introduction. I really appreciate it, Sam, and really excited to be here with this webinar hosted, masterclass webinar hosted by Hone. Gosh, what a, it seems like you and the team were way out ahead of ahead of the curve, putting together leadership training online, virtually, which of course is how all of us are learning now, including myself teaching online at NYU for the last semester, and it looks like again this semester. So congratulations to the Hone team for providing this incredible, valuable tools. I'm going to share my screen today and jump into the topic that everyone has joined, the purpose of joining the webinar today. So as Sam mentioned, I recently published a book, and really excited about this. I started working on CultureIQ 7 years ago, and fortunately, we've had over 1,000 companies that have worked with CultureIQ, utilizing its methodology for understanding culture, for measuring culture, for strengthening culture. And I really felt compelled to take the learnings from these 1,000 companies around the world and put it down in a format that anyone could learn from that, not just our customers, but really anyone that's interested in culture, that is empowered at their organization to be a leader around culture. And I would argue that everyone in a company is empowered to be a culture advocate. So the book itself, and we'll go through some of it today, but it really has 3 parts. So one is really taking the dimensions of culture, breaking it down to really understand what are the dimensions that make up a high performance company or a high performance organization, a high performance culture. What does the data tell us? Because we have data from over 1,000 companies. And then what are some case studies? What are people actually doing in practice to achieve a high performance culture? And then taking all that and ending each chapter with takeaways and tips. So today, the book obviously is hundreds of pages, and you can read it at your leisure and take from it hopefully many valuable insights. Today, we'll go through some highlights. I understand that the Hone team will be sending a signed copy of the book to anyone that wants to. They'll be asking you for your contact information if you're interested to receive a copy, and it would be my pleasure to sign it and make sure it's sent off. So if you like what you hear today, hopefully you'll enjoy my book even more. So just a little bit about more. I mentioned briefly my 8 years teaching at New York University at Stern, which is just so fulfilling to be teaching the next generation of leaders. So very excited, and I think this is my 9th year coming up, and unfortunately it will be online. It's always wonderful to be in person, but it's still been a great experience. And then CultureIQ, which of course is most relevant to what we'll be talking about today. Sam mentioned my involvement with Zappos. I was one of the early investors, one of the original investors, and a consultant there. So I had a really wonderful experience watching the organization grow from a handful of employees to 5,000 employees when we sold to Amazon, and just watching the culture over the past 21 years, even after its merger with Amazon, watching it, how the culture was continued to evolve really as an autonomous organization, and how they were really, they and we were really ahead of our time when putting in a lot of these culture programs even almost 20 years ago. So that's a bit of my background. More importantly, getting into, this is the CultureIQ team, getting into the topic today, what is culture? And you could look it up in the dictionary. The reason I have a photograph of a dictionary here When I first started work, when we first launched CultureIQ in the beginning of 2014, the word culture was the most looked up word in Webster Dictionary Online that year. So it was really, I feel, a turning point for a few reasons. One, companies recognized that all else being equal, culture could be the difference. We all have modern technologies, we all had modern leadership practices, but to really make a difference, to outperform your peer class, to retain and recruit the best people in the world, leaders recognize that culture was the difference. And every time you go to a leadership conference, an industry conference, although it's not a culture conference, very often the conference has a long track or many tracks regarding culture. The other thing that changed during this past 7 years, of course, is the millennial generation, which became the largest cohort in the workplace. So I'll talk a little bit about the future of work and what that means. But culture has evolved for many reasons, and obviously, we're all enlightened now and recognize the power of a high performance culture. So just for purposes of today, just having a simple definition, and we'll leave that as how things get done in your organization, right? So the most simple definition, how things get done. Here's a more complicated view, which you might see if you read books about this topic, sort of what we see at the tip of the iceberg, and of course, the iceberg being mostly underwater, kind of what we say is not necessarily what we see, but those are our values. And then what we believe, the underlying assumptions. So a lot of what is exhibited in the workplace, what we see, is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to culture. It's really also what we say and what we believe. So I mentioned the 7 years, the 1,000 companies. We have data scientists at CultureIQ that evaluate this information, and then we meet with companies over all these years. And really what we have learned is that there are 10 dimensions of a high performance culture. And you could argue there are 5, there are 15, and many of these are fungible, but you can see that it's not a surprise what these dimensions are. The tricky part is making sure that you have a high performance organization and that all these things are clicking. Because we are limited on time today, Sam and I thought we would just focus on the first 4. Again, you can request the book and read through all of the categories. We picked these 4 for a reason, and obviously, maybe even not obviously, but in my experience, mission and value alignment is where it all starts. And that's where we will start our conversation today. And then, of course, communication, which seems so straightforward, like riding a bike, but you'll be shocked at how many organizations just don't get this right. And then, given the environment that we're all working in today, the work environment and wellness, which we've really bundled together as critically important, especially since we're all working in unprecedented work environment. So those are the 4 areas we'll focus on: bundling, work environment, wellness. And so I do believe they're interrelated. So those are the topics we'll be covering today, the 3 topics. So for the first dimension, I'd like to just stop for a moment so I don't have to be talking at you for an hour. And I want to ask everyone to do a brief exercise. So you can even put this in the chat box. So I'm going to just open the chat box here on the right. I'd like everyone to think for a moment, and this exercise will only take about a minute or 2. Think about someone that you admire. And this person can be someone in your life. It could be anyone in the world. And this person doesn't have to be from current day. They don't have to be alive. They can be someone that has already passed. But I'd like you to think about someone that you really admire. And then just put down the 3 traits that you admire about this person, why you admire this person. Okay, so we can do that in the chat box. There's no wrong answer. there's a point to the exercise, but if everyone could just take a moment, make note in the chat box, and you can just write it down if you're not comfortable putting in the chat box. Think about a person you admire and 2 or 3 things that you admire about that person. Okay, and I'm going to open the chat box and start to see. Okay, and once you're done, take a look in the chat box and see some of the answers that people have provided. I see some of them are starting to scroll through. And I'm noticing that many of you aren't even listing the person, you're just listing the traits, which is absolutely the point of all this, of course. You're welcome to put the name of the person and the traits. And we'll wait another minute so that people can get through this exercise. Okay, so let's another 30 seconds. And this isn't a, you won't be graded. There won't, if you don't finish or you don't send it in, that's okay. All right, terrific. I see some wonderful responses coming through, and I'll just rattle through them. So you have honesty, hungry, hardworking, kind, perseverance, follow through, empathy, taking a step back when things are being rushed, true to beliefs, admits mistakes, believes in brotherhood and humanity, integrity, hard work. So I think you get the point. So this exercise, you can stop and feel free to read through some of the other answers. The point of this is when a company mission and values alignment is when people know, people understand and believe in your company's mission and values. I'm sure many of you have experienced this where you work in an organization and maybe their core values are listed on the website. Maybe they're on a conference room wall. Maybe it comes up once in a while. Same thing with mission of an organization or purpose. And I do this very often when I go and meet with companies. I ask the leaders, to tell me their core values. And it's always interesting to see the comfort or discomfort. Sometimes people will wiggle in their seat a little bit and then try to remember them and then rattle off a few of them. And the point of this is to have true mission and value alignment. These values need to be explicit. They need to be stated. People need to understand them. People need to understand that the company and the leaders make decisions, plan strategy, and take action based upon the values that the company, the stated values for the company, the mission of the organization. So the exercise you just did, it's very challenging for an organization to get buy-in from everyone to have mission and values that everyone not only knows but really buy into. So that exercise you just did, I did that exercise with the leadership team for my newest company. I've founded a new company over the last few years. And my last company, I'll go through the case of how we came up with our values. But this method that we just went through, this brief exercise, imagine doing this with 5, 6, 7, 10 people on your team, whether it's your leadership team or whether you're a manager and you're managing a team within an organization. Imagine everyone on the team lists 2 or 3 people that they admire and then what the traits that they admire. What you end up with is in one document, you end up with, if there are 5 people and everyone lists 3 to 6 values, you end up with 20 or 30 values that you all care about. There's inevitably overlap, and just circle the ones that are overlapped. And what you come down to is 5 or 6 values that people on your team share in common. values that you all care about. That's the quickest and easiest way to come up with core values, especially in a young company. And in a more tenured organization, of course, values and mission has been built over time. But even so, this is not a static process. You may have your values in your organization, but your values in your organization, when you have 10 or 20 people, it may be very different when you have 200 people or 2,000. Not that things aren't valuable anymore, but there may be other things that become very relevant. So here's why this is so important. I promised that I would share data and learnings over the past these 1,000 organizations. This is called a regression analysis, and there won't be any math on this call, but just to explain what this means, this is taking data. In this case, I think it's from about 287 companies. And the bottom axis where it says impact on ENPS, that is abbreviation for Employee Net Promoter Score. So what this is measuring is across these hundreds of organizations, the impact that each of these dimensions of culture has on employee satisfaction, on how employees feel about the organization. As you can, so the further it is to the right, as you see, mission and value is far right on this impact on employee net promoter score. It's a very important dimension of culture. And of course, we'll be talking about work environment today. You can see that is the highest impact on employee net promoter score, which is interesting because organizations everywhere are, the work environment has changed so dramatically over the past 6-9 months. So mission and value alignment has a tremendous impact on employee net promoter score. So I'm going to show two cases. So one, this is a young company. This is CultureIQ, about 9 months after we started. This is part of our leadership team. Actually, it was our entire leadership team, with the exception of the person taking the photograph. And we felt that we were in the middle of coding our software. We were in the middle of finding our first clients, building our plan. We took a step back. We took a train. We were in Manhattan. We took a train to upstate New York. We found a place. We went hiking. We found a place to build a fire and have lunch. And we as a group talked about what we felt would be important for the values of our organization for the next 5 years. And of course, it's not a static process. It can change. But what do we think will help us over the coming years? Not for the next week, not for the next month, not to launch our first product, but things that we felt would be important for the long term. And this was us preparing for that process. These are some of the questions that guided our process, right? So as a group, what is important to us? What brought us together? Right? What continues to hold us together, and what will guide us as we make these decisions? What are we proud of? Right? So we went through that process, and at the end of that process, we had 6 core values. And these values were, for the most part, in place for the next 5 years. The organization grew from 10 people to 130 people over the next 4 years. And some of these values had to be reconsidered. For example, when we were first starting, as you see on the top right, it says great people over great resumes. When we were first starting, we thought everyone could be a generalist, right? Everyone was wearing a lot of hats. But once we got to 110, 120, 130, as we started having much more specialized tasks, as opposed to just a handful of us doing everything, we recognized that we weren't going to make hiring decisions just because someone was great, even if their resume didn't have the right background. We actually needed to have both. So that value changed. And some of these continue on, and some of these had to change, but that was the process we went through. So with mission and value, and we're going to talk a little bit more about mission and values in a little bit, but I mentioned it's not static. You have to regularly reassess your values, right? We ended up, CultureIQ merged with another organization 2 years ago, and we did a reach out to all employees, asking them, not just from our existing organization, but from the organization that we acquired, do these values resonate with you? Do you believe this is what Culture IQ stands for today? Not 5 years ago, but today. Uh, and what we ended up doing was changing two of the values, eliminating one, changing one. We ended up with 4 core values. And the great part about the process is that everyone in the organization had a chance to comment. Right? We looked at all the comments, because if you don't have mission and value alignment, if people in the organization don't understand and believe the values that you're stating, then what's the point? Right? Then it's just values on the wall. Right? Now, this doesn't have to happen just within your senior management evaluating values. This can happen at the team level as a manager. You as a leader can and do this same exact exercise with your reports. You can do it for your division, for your department, making sure that your department, your division, your group, that there's alignment with your mission and your values, right? And then making sure that people are making decisions and communicating around these topics, right? Even in the recruiting process, right? If someone reads your website and sees your values, that's very nice, but it's even better if you have a conversation with the candidate and find out what is this person's values as it pertains to work. What are the things that they value in an organization, in a company's mission, in a company's values? And obviously, if they've seen your values, don't let them just restate them back. Ask them for examples. An example in your work or your life where this particular value became front and center. And if you have mission and values right from the very beginning during the interviewing process and right through the life cycle of your employees, then everyone will always recognize that you're shining a spotlight on that mission and value alignment, because that's our job as leaders, to shine a spotlight on what's important. If we don't believe that mission and values are an important part of the way we're running an organization, then no one will. Right? So it's your job to shine a spotlight right from the beginning of the life cycle when an employee is considering joining your organization, and right through their life cycle of that employee. So that is mission and value alignment. We are already 30 minutes in, so I'm going to keep going. The second one is always fun, right? Because everyone assumes that their organization communicates well, that their team communicates well, that they communicate well. So in communication, this isn't just you communicating to your team. This is also making sure that your employees know how to send information, how to escalate information, how to receive information, how to understand it, and making sure that they have the necessary information. Because very often, as leaders, we have the full context, we have all the information, but if there's a void of information, then it can be very challenging, right? So here, this is just a fun slide that gives an example of how we feel. We're all communicating, we're screaming from the mountaintops, but of course, making sure that people understand, have the context, making sure they have it timely, making sure they have the appropriate information is always the challenge. Here's why this is important. As you can see, again, going back to this analysis, and again, this is from data from closer to 1,000 companies. It turns out that although we all feel that we communicate well, and this is sort of the easy part of managing people or managing a company, it turns out that communication across a very large set of companies is the poorest dimension of culture, the most challenging dimension of culture, with the exception of wellness. So we'll talk about wellness in a few minutes. But as you can see, communication has a higher impact on employee satisfaction. The further to the right, the more impact it has on an employee's employee net promoter score. So communication is sort of tied with wellness as being the most challenging dimension of culture, but it has a slightly higher impact on how an employee is experiencing their company. So not only is it critically important, right? Because once you have your mission and values and you're aligned, and now you have to communicate it. You have to communicate your purpose. You have to communicate the tasks, the goals, the strategy. And unfortunately, what I find over the last 7 years, as I've been working with organizations in measuring this is consistently the most challenging dimension of culture, which is just amazing, but obviously something that we can all work on and focus upon. So I already this shouldn't be a surprise. Sharing the plan, right? You're a leadership team. You come up with an amazing strategy, come up with an amazing plan for execution, but sharing that plan with everyone. Means over communicating, but over communicating the most relevant facts. So here's a second case study, and some of you may be familiar with this, maybe you're not. KPMG is one of the sort of big four. It's back in, it used to be the big seven and the big four accounting and consulting organizations. It's the smallest of the big four, but in this particular case study, maybe the most innovative, at least at this point in time. KPMG had an exercise where they offered to the employees a prize. If 10,000 employees respond to this game that we're going to play, or this exercise, probably a better word, exercise, what they asked was, they asked for their employees to send in their specific interpretation of the organization's mission, right? So the organization asked for, the goal was to have 10,000 employees respond. They had over 40,000 employees respond. And I just love, this is one example on the left, right? So they're not considering themselves an accounting firm. Well, they are an accounting firm in this case, but really what they imagine themselves is they are a champion for democracy, right? Because they were helping to certify the first democratic election in South Africa, right? So this particular group that worked on this was so proud of the work they were doing. They weren't just number crunching; they were helping to certify a democratic process, right? So they had just this higher purpose exercise, similar to the exercise we did earlier, just really making sure that it's intentional, that this process is done in a way where employees recognize that there's much more to what we're doing than just our day-to-day work. On the right is the case study around communication. So what these two charts are showing us is when leaders are communicating the organization's purpose. Communicating purpose is the chart on the left. Notice the engagement levels for an organization that is communicating its purpose, and then, which is blue, the blue graph, the blue chart, and then next to it does not communicate its purpose, right? Half of the level of engagement. So this is saying that when the purpose of the organization is articulated and communicated well, the engagement level is almost double from this group of employees. And this is a Harvard Business Review study that was done with, again, a large set of data. And then on the right side of that, same thing, right? How often are you looking for a new job? And of course, as we all know, over the past 5 years, the duration or the tenure for employees has dropped from almost 3 years on average to less than 2 years. And it's very expensive to recruit and train people. So the fact that by simply communicating your purpose, articulating it, restating it, an employee is twice as likely to stay at your organization than not. As you can see from this study, they are less than half as frequently looking for a new job when they really understand the company's purpose. So I really love that particular case study. This is a list of takeaways. And again, if anyone's interested in this in a complimentary book, I have a longer list of takeaways and a lot more case studies. I just want to make sure that I share some highlights here. So I've added a few extra takeaways here for you, right? And some of them may seem very intuitive, and some of them maybe not. But just as this entire section of the presentation talked about, I'm not going to take it for granted that these are data points that you already have, right? So I'm articulating them, I'm defaulting to over communicating, and as the third bullet point notes, we often forget that the people on our team don't have the same context and information. Now they may trust you, but in the absence of information, people sometimes get anxious. People sometimes jump to the wrong conclusion. So over communicating is very important. As we're distributed, we will be talking about the workplace and wellness in a few moments. But as we are, most of 59%, I think, is the number, the recent number that I've read. 59% of us are working remotely. I think it was probably closer to 90% at the peak of the pandemic, although it feels like we're at a second peak right now. These numbers will continue to be high where people are working remotely, and we'll talk about some of these statistics in a few minutes. But it's even more important now to communicate on all topics, right? Not just a blog or newsletter, but really not having those weekly meetings, right? Because you cannot just grab someone, tap them on the shoulder, catch them in the cafe, meet them by the coffee or tea bar. You have to actually be intentional and proactive to have these weekly meetings and to make sure that you're spending time with your team to communicate. And then, of course, channels. I also hear, this could seem counterintuitive, but lots of people using Slack and Microsoft Teams and other tools that are available. Some employees actually can get a bit frustrated because they don't know. Communication, again, is knowing where to find information, knowing where to send information. So sometimes people will become frustrated. Do I go to Slack? Do I go to Teams? Do I go to my email? Am I doing this over chat? Is this something I should be doing in person? So this is where it's very important to not only have all of these tools and to communicate and even over communicate, but also making sure that as your culture evolves, that people understand where they should be finding information and where they should be sending information. If Slack is where you put your clubs and your common interests and your celebrations, great. Make sure people know that. If email is where you are communicating pertinent business topics, great. Let your people know. So just making sure that I'm not steering you in the direction of over communicating in a way that will frustrate your people. Make sure people understand where they send and receive information. Okay, how are we doing on time? All right, this is the third topic. We've bundled work environment and wellness together. And just to give a working definition as we talk through this topic, so I think it's pretty straightforward, right? A company with a great work environment is a comfortable workplace where people have the resources to be effective. Of course, the workplace has been turned upside down in the last 9 months. So this is why this topic is one that I'm highlighting today. And then wellness, of course, people can interpret wellness in many different ways. And some people don't think of their organization as being being responsible for helping you to maintain your physical and mental health. But of course, the fact that we spend the majority of our waking hours in the workplace, it has a tremendous impact on our physical and mental health. And a company that values your wellness has resources available to help you with this important, very important part of your experience. So here's a really interesting dichotomy you see here in this analysis, right? So you see work environment is, I mentioned earlier, is the number one impact on how an employee experiences its culture, how employees feel about the organization. Fortunately, it's very high rating across these organizations, but of course, that's a good thing because it has the highest correlation with how employees are experiencing their company. The thing that I find interesting is wellness, which I lump these two together, but you could see it's the opposite corner of this chart, right? Employees, so to interpret this for you, employees are saying that wellness isn't necessarily having a high correlation on how the culture, how they're experiencing their company. And I find in my learnings, as I talk to many organizations and many employees don't necessarily recognize that a company can have an impact on their wellness. And what I would argue is the fact that we're spending most of our time, our waking hours at work, companies with the highest performing culture are being proactive to make sure that there are resources for mental and physical health, and not letting employees sort of fend for themselves, because it is, I believe, from the data, that it's a critical part. The other reason why it's important here is notice where it falls on this chart. It has the lowest score. So employees, when they describe how they feel about how they perceive the culture in an organization, wellness is even lower than communication. So to interpret this, employees don't necessarily feel it's a company's responsibility, but they rate it the lowest dimension of culture across these 10 dimensions. So I've put them together because I do believe that they are interrelated, especially today. And when I say today, this is what if we're even in the office, right, we're 6 feet apart from each other, it makes it very challenging for the physical cues, right? Even the smile, if someone is talking to you, those physical cues, to really understand how people are perceiving you and perceiving the context of what you're speaking. We're going to, so here is another reason why this is very important. This is another data set, but notice the work-life balance. Again, I mentioned how wellness is a critically important dimension of culture, and companies should be intentional and provide resources. Notice, excluding salary, a good work-life balance is the highest level of importance for again this group of large data set of employees that have been surveyed. And then the third thing on this list, the third data point, flexibility, remote working, flexible hours. This study was done before the pandemic, and as you can see, it was already a top 3 item. And the fact that good work-life balance and flexibility, remote working, flexible hours, are top 3. This is why you see why I bundle them together. Now, the second item, opportunities to progress and be leaders, this is why HONE is so important, right? Because this is why you're all on this call, right? Because we all want to progress as leaders, and we find it to be one of the 3 most important things in what we're experiencing at work. So I think, Sam, you were going to do a quick poll, and I'm not sure if this is the right time yet or not. Did you? I think you're muted right now. We were going to have a brief interactive poll.
Yeah, sure. In light of a poll, we'd love to use the chat for sure. a 1 through 10 rating here. Perhaps for folks, Greg, I think you mentioned wanting folks to take a look at these factors and which ones are particularly high at work right now, and which ones feel low, either on your team or at the organizational level. So perhaps in the chat, if you would, just throwing out, as you look at these factors and their relative importance, where do you feel, what are some of the strengths of your organization, or what are one area for improvement? We'd love to see that in the chat. Yeah.
And we won't send this to anyone. We won't share it with your leadership team. If you're, this is for the benefit. This is to make this exercise, this masterclass interactive, right? So that you can share with others what you have found to be important. Okay, and Sam, why don't you just repeat what you're asking people to do, just so that people are
seeing some of it come in. So I think maybe the top strength from that list there, when you think about your current work environment and situation, and then what's an area for improvement. And see Barry writing in, one strength is a sense of purpose, which is wonderful. And Julie saying work-life balance is decent for manufacturer. There you go. I like the transparency, Julie. Barry saying weakness is work-life balance. Absolutely. I know a lot of folks feel that way today.
Yep, sorry, I've gone back to the list. I noticed I went ahead accidentally.
Opportunities for international travel might not be high here for most folks.
Okay, while people are, Sam, did you want to wait for some more responses?
Sure.
Oh, there we go. Here's some more running through. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. This is really important. Please keep sharing these. Again, this is for the benefit of everyone else on the call. And of course, the notes that are coming through, it warms my heart because it obviously shows that there's alignment amongst what you were expecting to hear today and what you feel is important. So that's really terrific. Here's some more data. Just finish to make sure that we finish and respect everyone's time. I want to just jump back in and make sure we get through some other really important data. So these are some sort of future of work statistics that I think are really important. And remember, this is long-term data and not pandemic data. Pandemic data has dramatically changed these numbers. So for one, before the pandemic, 60% of us needed to coordinate or collaborate with 10 or more people to get our work done, right? That's amazing. And that hasn't changed. That's pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. The middle number, 43% of Americans spend part of their time working remotely. The fact is that before the pandemic, 5% of the workforce approximately were considered remote workers. That number went from 5% remote to 95% remote in a snap of the fingers. And the reason this is important as it pertains to culture, because there was such a small percentage of employees working remotely, organizations were typically accommodating a one-off request, right? They were accommodating, there wasn't a company-wide policy, there wasn't company-wide infrastructure, and there wasn't, even think about the processes that had needed to be put in place, onboarding employees remotely, recruiting remotely, when an employee leaves an organization, doing all that in a remote experience. So it's really amazing. The future of work, I like to say, the future of work has arrived because I do believe there's going to be a significant, this trend from working remotely was 3% 20 years ago, and it climbed up to 5%. I think many of us recognize as leaders and employees recognize as well that we can be very effective working remotely, and a lot of the tools, things like Hone, where a lot of the training can be done remotely, is here. The future is here. So I just wanted to share this. Now, some of the challenges, of course, I mentioned in a prior slide, inability to read nonverbal cues, right, is cited as the most challenging thing about working in a distributed team. That's why it's just so important to communicate, to be explicit, to have these intentional weekly meetings. And of course, we all get Zoom fatigue, but being able to see the person you're speaking to and speaking with is very important. Some other trends I mentioned at the beginning of this, that the millennial generation is now the largest cohort in the workplace. And by 3 years from now, 4 years from now, will be 75% of the workforce. It's just a staggering number. I remember 7 years ago, I would go and talk to leaders, and most of them were not millennials. And they asked me, what are we going to do about this group? And I said to them, in the next few years, the millennials will be the majority of the workforce, or the largest cohort, and they will be the managers. And they're going to be saying in this same type of meeting, what are we going to do about you, right? What are we going to do about the baby boom generation that is now not the majority, right? So it's we have multiple generations that are working together. It's unprecedented. And as you know, it is the average tenure at an organization has gone from, I mentioned, 60-something% decrease. It is expensive to recruit and train. So all these things, flexibility over pay, and life-work balance, all these things are under the spotlight right now, especially as we're in this pandemic. People are rethinking what's important to them, where they live, how they live, where they work, how they work. So as leaders, it's just such an important thing. And again, I would argue that the workplace and wellness are completely linked. Because if you think about how people are considering their work-life balance right now, it is a balance of their wellness and their workplace. Here's another interesting case study. This was a 3-year study. Some of you may be familiar with this. This is a large global organization. We did a study for 3 years in the United States division. It's a retail, fast casual restaurant group. And what we did was we took all their culture data over 3 years, during a 3-year period, and we also took their revenue data, their operating profit, their total KPI, their total metric score, and their employee engagement score. And we took the culture dimensions and their operating metrics and overlapped them to see the correlation. It turned out that the work environment for this particular organization was, as you can see, it impacted their revenue, the green dot, the operating profit, green dot, and the total score. The blue dot, meaning the work environment, was the primary driver or the highest correlation to employee satisfaction. So this matches the chart that you saw earlier where work environment was in the top right corner. Well, this was a 3-year study. It showed that the work environment was indeed the top driver for employee satisfaction. But the thing I also point out, the reason I'm showing this slide, is that revenue, operating profit, total score, these other business metrics were also highly correlated, as noted by the green dot. The far right, mission and values, notice again during this 3-year study that was a primary driver of employee satisfaction. Now, these people are working in a restaurant, they're cooking food, they're cleaning tables, they're working a cash register, and mission and value alignment is the primary driver of their employee satisfaction. And that's in an industry with 120% annual turnover. So you can see it's important in every industry. Then, which we're not talking about today, accountability or responsibility, but I would, just to point out just a little teaser, notice that the primary driver of their business metrics was employees feeling empowered, right? And that over the 3-year study, we found that the way these employees felt empowered, the more frequently they had conversations with their leader, the more empowered they felt to take action. So your leadership and you having those conversations with your employees, in this case, was a #1 driver for this organization accomplishing its business metrics. So, and I have that case study in print if people are interested. And just some takeaways that are probably pretty obvious, but just a couple of them, right? Now that everyone's working remotely, 95% of employees did not. Just make sure that people aren't guessing, what's appropriate, what are the policies, what are the procedures. Just put it all down. And if you need to collaborate with your employees because this is all new and unprecedented, even better, right? Get buy-in from everyone. Review the tools, right? Do you need a VPN? Are you in an industry where data is really sensitive and people now feel they can't access data to accomplish their roles, right? So making sure that people can access that. Are people missing phone calls, assuming people still use a phone? And then just creating virtual ways for people to communicate, and whether that's through Slack, through Microsoft Teams, through Zoom, through your intranet, just making sure that people can connect and making that a priority as well. The wellness takeaways, this is maybe some of these things you already have at your organization. Again, amazing how employees just feel that their company really cares when these programs are available. And the irony is, many of these programs are available through your PEO, if you use a professional employment organization, or if you have some other human resources platform that you use, but often people aren't even aware of them, right? So just making sure that you have that information available, because even now more so than ever over the last 9 months, people's flow, people's lifestyle, people's work-life balance, where they work, how they work has changed so dramatically. It's really important that you think about people's well-being and making sure, doing those check-ins and making sure people have resources that are available. So that is the last slide, and we're coming up at the top of the hour. Sam, did you want to open for questions, and did you want that through the chat box, or how would we
Sure.
bet?
Yeah, thanks, Greg, and thanks
Of
for
course.
so many really thoughtful insights and data and the research behind how to build a thriving culture. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I know that we're also coming up on time. So I want to ask you one follow-up, Greg, and then get folks a link to the survey if they'd like to get your book, which is very kind to offer. One question is, last 2 weeks of 2020, what a crazy year this has been. Do you have any thoughts as folks think about the next few weeks and moving into 2021? What are some 10% shifts that folks can make now to help improve culture at their organizations as we look towards the end of the year? Does anything come to mind?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've had so many people reach out to me, and reporters as well, asking, are companies going to be downsizing their offices? Are companies going to be changing compensation for employees that have moved from a major metropolitan area to a suburban location that may be less expensive? Employees don't know. I know employees, many examples of employees that have moved during the pandemic and haven't even told their company. They're just assuming there'll be flexibility. So I would say get out in front of this, right? Determine are you going to decrease your footprint? Are you going to encourage people to live and work where they want to work? Are you going to have new policies? Because people are guessing right now. They're wondering, do I need to find a new employer because my company's never allowed me to live in Colorado? They always needed me to be in Manhattan, right? Find out what people, be proactive, because if we're all just guessing, then we're going to make decisions without proper information.
Makes sense. Thank you for that, and thanks for being with us this hour. Just to wrap it, I'll share my screen quickly. For all of you who came today, thank you for your attention and your engagement. And just want to offer you this special 20% discount to Hone membership. Includes access to our social learning platform and 15 plus leadership classes every month. Here's some upcoming highlights on evaluating team performance. So important as we come to the close of the year. How to build high trust relationships with a focus on remote workers, nonviolent communication and diffusing conflict, and how to master meetings, something that I know many of us are thinking about in a virtual world as well. You can go to honehq.com, promo code culture, and get that 2-week free membership, and then a 20% discount on moving forward.